Once Upon a Time is a crazy show. The ABC drama about a bunch of fairy tale characters like Jiminy Cricket, cursed to live in a town in Maine with no memory of who they are, ran for 7 seasons. Split between stories in Maine and stories in the interconnected fantasy realm these characters are explained to come from, this is not the Jiminy Cricket you know. He's still a cricket when he's not in Maine, but now he's not only helping Pinocchio, but serving on a war council with Snow White and the 7 dwarves, who are at war.
I say we fight.
Giving into one's dark side never accomplishes anything.
Can we even trust Rumpelstiltskin?
Movies like Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters and Snow White and the Huntsman, dark and self-aware fantasy interpretations were in during the 2010s, but so was minimalism and silly bands, so we can't blame them for feeling empty. The retelling of these stories as big, sexy action movies did not escape Disney, especially after their Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland in 3D grossed over $1 billion. It just kind of made sense for them to create new interpretations of all of their fantasy characters for network TV. While they're trying to present these characters in a new way for audiences, most of the changes made really help to explain how all of these stories are like interconnected with each other. And the show borrows heavily from Disney's existing adaptations of these works, so much of their original significance is just stripped away. Yeah, this is Billiam. As a kid, I watched a few seasons of Once Upon a Time. You could call me a dork for that. That just means you like me. Once Upon a Time ran for 7 seasons with its own dedicated fan base, but critically, the show was always a mixed bag through its entire run, which I think is a very apt reputation for the show. It's not uncommon to see well-directed and performed scenes with an interesting enough setup to sell the drama, but the show is really held back. Oftentimes, the construction of the fantasy world is very cheap looking with an overuse of green screen. Green screen floors never look good, and its ridiculous premise not only requires you to be invested in these fantasy characters turned into real people, but also the interconnected fantasy realm where all of them come from and where everybody knows each other. Remixing existing story elements is kind of a key aspect to the show. Like, what if Little Red Riding Hood was actually the big bad wolf as a werewolf? Or what if Cinderella's fairy godmother was actually Rumpelstiltskin, who was also like the Joker? What if the Huntsman, the Mad Hatter, and Captain Hook were sexy? The Huntsman in the original Snow White is one of the most homely looking characters ever, but the guy who plays him here literally went on to play Christian Grey, sex icon of a generation. So let's take a look at the ridiculousness of ABC's Once Upon a Time and illustrate how it plays an important role in Disney solidifying their existing brand, their interpretations of these characters. I don't want to be, but I'm so cynical about this show. This video is sponsored by Star Trek Fleet Command. The Borg are back, baby. Star Trek Fleet Command is a free-to-play MMORPG now available on iOS, Android, and Windows. This month has new missions all about the Borg, featuring fan favorite Hugh the Borg. Help him stop a scientist's quest for revenge against the Collective. You can also save an eager Pakled from himself as he tries to get the Borg to assimilate him on purpose. Prevent the Borg from assimilating the technology behind your AI assistant Maya. There's so many missions. The new feature called Fleet Commanders allows you to assign well-known Star Trek heroes and villains to oversee strategy from their star bases for increased power and effectiveness. Fleet Commanders launches with 3 choices: Admiral Kirk, Captain Spock, and Locutus of the Borg. Build the Command Center, a new starbase location from which you can manage your Fleet Commanders. You can join the fight now by downloading the game using the link below or this QR code on screen. I promise it's not the Borg Cube. Thank you again to Star Trek Fleet Command for sponsoring this video. So each episode of Once Upon a Time features 2 primary storylines, one taking place on Earth, mostly in the fictional town of Storybrooke, Maine, and one taking place in Fantasy World, with the hope that each story creates a thematic and narrative thread between characters and places. The show opens up inside the fantasy realm immediately following the events of Snow White. She and the prince are getting married, but the evil queen returns, vowing to get her revenge. But the newlyweds are confident that love will win and the evil queen will lose. Love loses. In the real world, we meet the main character, Emma, a bail bondsman out catching a crook. This guy thinks she's the sexiest, friendless orphan around. That's a piece of dialogue in the show.
The sexiest,
friendless orphan.
But she's hardcore. One day, her biological son Henry comes along and says, "You have to come with me. Everyone in Storybrooke, Maine is a fairy tale character. My mom, the evil queen, has cursed everyone to live in Maine. You're Snow White's daughter," he says, "chosen to save everyone from the curse after your 28th birthday." Concerned that his parents might be Disney adults, she accompanies Henry back to Storybrooke, Maine for a general wellness check. Henry has his storybook, which tells him about all of the people in the town and allows him to guess who they actually are in the fairy tale world. Besides Henry, the rest of the town has been frozen in time, not moving ever since the curse began. It's like Main Street USA in this bitch. And I don't see anywhere for a corn dog. There's even character greetings. There's Henry's teacher, Snow White, who like everyone else in town has a new name. Mary Margaret. She watches after the prince, a coma patient at the hospital she works at. A little role reversal. Will she kiss his unconscious body? Cinderella's in town working as a waitress, working for some characters that don't have a notable Disney adaptation. Little Red Riding Hood, Ruby, and her granny, still called Granny. And a lot of the property in town is owned by Rumpelstiltskin, Mr. Gold. Throughout the show, Once Upon a Time used recognizable characters to draw new audiences in. Ariel from The Little Mermaid, the Wicked Witch of the West was a big villain in later seasons, and I could not go anywhere without hearing that Elsa was going to be on Once Upon a Time. They put their whole budget into announcing this after Frozen had its big $1 billion at the box office. I stopped watching at this point, but it was just a moment in which everybody kind of turned to the show and just recognized how deeply rooted in Disney's catalog it was. And even Walt Disney himself is written into the mythology of the world when he's revealed to be a part of a long line of authors who've contributed to the magic book Henry reads from. It's like the Bible. But like in this universe, if like Snow White was this like badass survivalist and Walt Disney chose to make a movie that did not depict her that way at all, wouldn't that make him like a really sexist piece of actually? I don't care what the history is, a woman doesn't do that. Mythologizing Walt Disney in a literal way like this in this story makes me want to like vomit. If Once Upon a Time were on today, Lin-Manuel Miranda would be on it as Alexander Hamilton.
If I can prove that I never touched my balls.
That wouldn't even be the weirdest curveball. This character in season 1, this doctor character, you'll never guess who he's revealed to be. This guy's Dr. Frankenstein. This is like the public domain Avengers, I swear to God. Not that God shows up in this either. Look at this clip of Elsa freezing Grumpy. She dabs on him. What an image to put to screen. It's pretty wild, but you could say at the heart of the show is the relationship between Emma, Henry, and Henry's adoptive mother, Regina, the evil queen who has cursed the town to be in this limbo state. Mare Mommy Queen. That's who she is to Henry. Regina quickly realizes that Emma is the chosen one, sworn to slap Regina around a little bit and break the curse. But Regina adopted Henry in a genuine attempt to raise a kid, but Rumpelstiltskin is the one who arranges the queen to adopt Henry specifically in hopes that it will one day bring Emma to the town to break the curse. Rumpelstiltskin's like a character who's believed to be just as powerful as the queen, so there's a sort of fun element in trying to figure out if Mr. Gold actually knows what's going on in the town, or if the curse has worked the same for him and erased his memory. It drives the queen crazy because she doesn't know if he knows.
Your name?
He does know. Regina is an evil person trying her best to be a good mom. And very quickly, Emma becomes a popular figure in the town, so as mayor, she kind of has this political pressure to allow Emma to have some sort of relationship with Henry. This leaves Regina in a very emotionally vulnerable position, since Emma is Henry's birth mother, and Henry has expressed much more interest in getting to know her than his adoptive mother. This awkward back and forth between Regina and Emma as motherly figures in Henry's life makes for interesting drama, to the point where they start punching each other, and we totally get it. Storybrooke feels like the kind of little wholesome town you see in so many different shows, the kind of town that feels like it's just built on a set. It would have been cool to see a more guerrilla style in the real world to contrast the fantasy world, but the town is supposed to be a construction of the evil queens, so its unnatural quality could kind of lean into that, though the show did actually film in a real town. Production ran in such a way that none of these these little businesses had to shut down, and the public was very often allowed to watch filming. So that's pretty cool. The fantasy world, on the other hand, did not have all the resources it needed to really come into fruition. Like, this was the same time Game of Thrones was airing, and obviously that show was notable for its budget. So Once Upon a Time is left with having to use an overwhelming amount of green screen and digital locations to build its fantasy world. It does not look good. The universal lighting for the green screen studio just makes all of the Emmy-nominated costumes look so bad, though some of its smaller sets and exterior shots are shot on location. If it wasn't for the light swearing, light sex, and light violence, this show would really be at home on Disney Channel. They even do a musical episode, and the music is exactly on par with Freaky Friday the Musical. It blows my mind that this show and Descendants aren't in the same universe. Snow White is sort of the central story of the fantasy world within season 1. A lot of the drama happening is in relation to that story's plot beats. Like, before the story of Snow White, we see the birth of the dwarf Dreamy, one of the 7 dwarves.
Rock and stone, brother!
We watch how he falls in love with this jellyfish fairy, but dwarves, they're not allowed to have relationships, and his heart is broken.
This is the way the world works! Why? I don't know.
The dwarf society as depicted in Once Upon a Time is the most ridiculous thing ever.
Bossy, hand me another axe.
The boss of the 7 dwarves is named Bossy. Dreamy breaks his old axe and Bossy hands him a new one, and that's when we see his name transform into Grumpy. It's not just something he decides for himself, it's like bestowed upon him.
It's Grumpy now.
It's Grumpy now. And that's the story of how Dreamy became Grumpy. That's heartbreaking material for some people. But then in the real world, Grumpy and the fairy have been reunited again. But she's a nun now? That's not gonna stop him from trying. Perhaps Grumpy will learn to dream again. But the all-time greatest character in Once Upon a Time is Stealthy. Stealthy is in 2 scenes and mentioned in 1 scene. Some of the dwarves are breaking into a castle and they get help from Stealthy. Of course they would, like that's what he does. But then he gets shot.
Stealthy, no!
They lose Stealthy. Stealthy dies. Then when we see Grumpy's flashback, he's trying to sneak out to go see his fairy girlfriend, but Stealthy catches him trying to sneak out.
You know, if you wanted to sneak out, you should have come to me.
It's like what he does. He sneaks around. He's stealthy. And then in the season finale, when they're raiding the evil queen's castle in the war, Grumpy says, "I miss Stealthy." Now you know the best thing Once Upon a Time did. A lot of the stories end up changing just as a result of them being fit into this fantasy realm place where everybody lives together and knows each other. I mean, Pinocchio takes place in regular old Italy, and Mulan is from China, not the generic sounding The Empire as explained through Once Upon a Time's lore. From the beginning, Once Upon a Time embraces this large, disjointed comic book type universe where all of these things that were not designed to work together are just like mashed together. It also feels like such a strategic time for this show to release because it came out right before the first Avengers came out. Like they just wanted the audience to be thinking about crossovers. The fantasy realm we see isn't the only realm in the Once Upon a Time multiverse. Mad Sebastian Mad Hatter Stan Hatter takes us to this Nightmare Before Christmas style like door world where we also see entrances to like Oz and Wonderland from Alice in Wonderland. I'm sure if we turned around, we'd also see an entrance to the arcade from Wreck-It Ralph. Their Cinderella episode is a perfect example of some of the clever ways they try to make these worlds interconnected. Instead of Cinderella meeting her fairy godmother, she meets Rumpelstiltskin, somebody known for making deals instead of granting wishes. And Cinderella becomes the one who promises him her firstborn child, though she gets leverage when she finds out she's having twins. That's actually a plot point. Also, did you know in the Once Upon a Time universe, the magic mirror from Snow White is actually the genie from Aladdin trapped inside? You see, when the genie was freed, the guy who freed him was like, I've heard that wishes go bad. You can have my last wish, genie. And he's like, I don't want to learn my lesson from all the people I've granted wishes to who've gotten screwed over. I'm gonna wish to be with the evil queen forever. And then he becomes the magic mirror with her forever, but you know, as a mirror. Also, that is Giancarlo Esposito as the genie and the mirror man. He appeared on this show just 3 weeks after he was written off of Breaking Bad. This is his follow-up role. So if you love Breaking Bad, you gotta give this show a chance. No, you do not. No, you don't. Rumpelstiltskin, like the evil queen, is a really important instigative character. Being at the center of many of these stories, they also rewrite Rumpelstiltskin to be the Beast in Beauty and the Beast. He's really gross. Some people watch him laugh and go, look at all these sexy Rumpelstiltskin photos they took for promo pics. So as an example of how these stories kind of like intertwine with each other, once they get to Storybrooke, the terms of Rumpelstiltskin and Cinderella's deal has been carried over. But Emma, being the main character, is able to help Cinderella navigate the situation and realize that she can't like legally promise somebody her unborn child. Rumpelstiltskin is explained to be the Dark One.
I'm frightened.
I'm not.
A wielder of an ancient evil magic that he took on because he was tired of being weak and meek. Just lift some weights, Rumple. You don't have to take on the burden of pure malice and ill intent. You can go to the gym. One-off episodes like the Hansel and Gretel storyline might be where the show shines best. Flashbacks serve as a retelling of the myth, and the Storybrooke storyline is a sort of sequel in which Emma, as the acting sheriff, has to help reunite them with the father they lose at the beginning of the story. She finds him and he's like, I can't take care of kids.
I can barely manage this garage. I can't manage 2 kids.
That's just simple good writing. I can barely handle my garage. Is this a wrench in my hand? Sometimes in the morning I pour myself a bowl of cereal and I accidentally pour motor oil instead. So Emma becomes the sheriff because the huntsman is dramatically killed. He was only in it for a few episodes, but the role left an impact because I remember when he was cast as Christian Grey, they literally said Once Upon a Time's huntsman is Christian Grey. He's actually the evil queen's submissive little sexy time friend. She holds his heart hostage, like literally through magic. Then she crushes it. Yuck. Arouses me though. He actually remembers everything about the fantasy world right before he dies. Sorry, Henry, nobody believes in you. Surprisingly, the show chose not to play with the idea that maybe Henry is just a goofy kid making this all up. It would have been fun for like 2 or 3 episodes, you know? People are occasionally concerned about his obsessive belief that all of the stories in his book are actually real, but the audience never doubts it. So particularly during its early run, Once Upon a Time was marketed as a spiritual successor to Lost. That's how I got baited into watching it. The flashback formula of having 2 narratives running every episode is lifted directly from Lost. Multiple Lost actors appear in the show, props share brand names, and Lost's mysterious cursed numbers 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, and 42 appear everywhere in the show. The clock is stuck at 8:15 until Emma arrives, which is a shared number with Lost's fated to crash flight number, Oceanic 815. Now, the direct connection between these 2 shows, besides many of the actors, come from writers Adam Horowitz and Edward Kitsis, who served as writers and producers on Lost and admittedly added a great pop culture sensibility to the show.
We love writing Sawyer.
Wasting your time, Yoda.
When Sawyer can be snarky as opposed to get into father issues, which we leave to other writers.
Once Upon a Time makes tons of references, not just through their characters, but also just for fun. A flower truck is called Game of Thorns. Henry loves reading recently acquired by Disney Marvel Comics, especially the ones written by Lost co-creator Damon Lindelof. A double reference, 2 for 1. Now, like these 2, I also find references to Tallahassee, Florida to always be funny.
He's from Tallahassee, and they're like, haha.
From what I've gathered, Horowitz and Kitsis really are the kinds of guys who would have a great time discussing the power difference between Rumpelstiltskin and the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio. Now, Rumpelstiltskin's more powerful than the fairy godmother in Cinderella. That's established. Nowadays, we'd call these guys Funko Pop collectors.
It's part of what I am.
And don't get me wrong, I have my 2 Funko Pops, Serena and Blair from Go Piss Girl, right over there. But I don't need a 3rd Funko Pop. This show is like a wall of Funko Pops. Jiminy Cricket's dog, its name is Pongo, like from 101 Dalmatians. It's not even a regular dog, it's a reference dog. It couldn't just be a regular Dalmatian. And Cruella de Vil does show up in season 4 of this show. What is she gonna do against like a dragon?
Oh shit, never mind, they give her a gun.
Is 101 Dalmatians really like one of the great fairy tales of our time? I don't think so. Some creative decisions from the ground up were made to differentiate this show from Lost. There's more of a focus on maternal trauma since Lost focuses so much on paternal trauma. Just explorations of how your parents you up. The evil queen being a bad person, trying to be a good mother is sort of at the core of this. She's been hurt by her own mother, and now she finds her retaliation against those who she sees as her enemies, hurting her own child, which like is a good personal conflict for this character to have. But I can't help but to think they're just trying to do to the evil queen what Wicked did to the Wicked Witch of the West, Elphaba. I find myself responding to things in this show oh so cynically. Nobody comes or goes from Storybrooke. One of the biggest mysterious moments in this season is when some guy comes riding in on his motorcycle. Who is he? Nobody comes or goes from Storybrooke, and this guy just comes on in motorcycling.
Hey, I didn't catch your name.
That's because I didn't give it.
But having seen this as a kid, I laughed my ass off during this scene again, because that's Pinocchio. Pinocchio wears a leather jacket in this universe. A key element to Once Upon a Time is its subversive and new takes on fantasy stories that we all presumably know. Like Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. She eats her boyfriend when she manages to get away from Granny one full moon. Sorry, Red Riding Hood.
On all levels except physical, I'm a wolf.
He wasn't the wolf. Don't like this.
I bet you don't like it. You ate your boyfriend. What if when the prince wakes up, he's actually already married and he can't overcome his emotional connection to Mary Margaret, who he doesn't even know is Snow White? This character, Prince Charming, not to be confused with Prince Charming from Cinderella. The original Snow White prince is just called the Prince. This guy sucks. He doesn't know how to break up with his wife and be with Snow White, and he doesn't know how to tell Snow White he hasn't broken up with his wife yet. Like on Valentine's Day, he gives a card to Snow White and he actually wrote it to his wife. Like, how do you up that bad? Why would you write 2 Valentine's Day cards?
Catherine, I woof you.
So, sorry. I meant this one.
Like, shut the up, David. How do you fumble it that hard?
And now everyone is calling me a tramp.
You mean like the dog? Subversive fantasy has been around as long as there's been fantasy. But Disney was shaken to their core, especially by Shrek, and Wicked. The world in Once Upon a Time just feels like the world from Shrek or Into the Woods. I think the reason why I am so cynical about Once Upon a Time is because Disney has put Mickey's whole mouse Ussy into lobbying to change copyright laws to prevent their characters from going into the public domain. When the only reason why Disney was able to become the company that it is today and make a show like Once Upon a Time was through adapting works in the public domain. And even though Once Upon a Time borrows heavily from Disney's intellectual property, it's really reliant on the public domain. The public domain belongs to everyone, and Disney has dove into that well time and time again to make a stupid little story. But then they've lobbied to change the same laws that allowed them to have access to those materials. Future generations deserve to f around with Mickey Mouse. They deserve to f around with the Joker. Maybe they'll f each other, and Penguin Random House can publish it without getting sued.
Just smile and wave, boys.
Once Upon a Time is a celebration of the public domain, but if it were up to Disney, they would own every single character in that show. But fortunately for all of us, we still have Shrek 4 Rumpelstiltskin. See ya.